Let's now learn about HTML attributes, classes, and IDs, and then also learn about a couple more different HTML elements. So what are attributes? Well, in HTML, some elements can have attributes, and these attributes basically describe elements. So let's, for example, create a link, and this link will be inside of this paragraph. Okay, so as you already saw, we can nest elements inside one another. For example, this h1 is inside the body, and this p element is also inside the body. So they are child elements of the body element. Okay, so I forgot to mention that in the last lecture. Anyway, so let's now add this link element inside of the paragraph. And for that, we use the anchor element. So it's an A. And then in here, we put a text that we want to be displayed on the page. So just like before in the paragraph, for example. So here I want to place a link to my profile on Udemy. So let's say Jonas on Udemy. But now, how do we tell the browser where this link should actually point to? And that's where the attributes come in. So as I said, we use attributes to describe elements. And in this case, we describe this anchor element using the href attributes. And so href stands for hypertext reference. And so here we put the URL where this link should point to. Okay, and so let's actually get my profile page on Udemy. So Jonas, Udemy, and that's actually the link, I think. Yes. So let's copy this and put it here. Okay, give it a save. And now, well, here we have to reload it. So sometimes it doesn't work. Sometimes we have to reload. Okay, so when you don't see it changing right away, just reload and then it will work. So here we have this now blue link. And so that's the standard format of any HTML link. And when we now click this, indeed, it goes to my user page here on Udemy. And of course, you can use your own link or whatever link you want to use. Okay, and then we can go back and we're back on this page. Okay, so that's what we used this href attribute for. We described the anchor element by telling it which URL it should go to whenever we click on the link. Now here on the page, you can actually see that this text here, so this link, is right in line with the previous text. So the text here in this paragraph. That's why we call the anchor element an inline element. Okay, so it flows in line with the rest of the text. Now on the other hand, for example, this h2 element here is a so-called block element. Because as we see here, this heading is not in line with the text of the previous element. It created a new line which only contains this content of this heading, right? So all of this here is this huge block, and so it's a block element, not an inline element. Okay, so we can actually include this link here in a sentence. So let's say you can learn more about it, and then let's say on Udemy. Here we need a space. Okay, and so now this looks like a normal sentence and then with a link in it. And we can even put a period after it. Great, so let's check out another element which needs attributes, which is the image element. So let's do that after this. Some more space here. And for the image, we use the img tag and then the source attribute. And then in here, we can specify any image from the current working folder, or we can also set an image URL. So let's do that. So what I'm doing here is, since we're talking about HTML and CSS on this page, I want to copy this, this image here. Okay, so the image address. So I'm getting the image address here, and now I'm pasting it here. And so this JPEG image is now the source of this image. Okay, and now you see here that with the autosave, it added this closing slash. And that's because the image element does not have a closing tag. It only has an opening tag, which is img, of course, but then we don't have a closing tag. And so we can close this opening tab by the end using this slash here at the end of the tag. But it's actually not mandatory. It works just the same without this one here. Okay? So image doesn't have a closing tag because we don't really put any like written content in here. It's not like we say now course image or something and then close the image, right? That would make no sense. And so that's why images don't need the closing tag. Now, if we check it, indeed here now is the image. Okay, so that's the source attribute. And as you see, different elements have different attributes. So for example, the href attribute is not going to do anything on an image. And the opposite is true for the source attribute. So if we use source here on the anchor element, it's not going to have any effect. And so when you really learn HTML properly, you will then learn exactly which attributes you can use on which elements. But it's actually pretty straightforward and you get used to it pretty quick. Now, there are two very important attributes that we can actually use on all elements and which we can use to identify them. And these are classes and IDs. So we use classes and IDs to essentially name elements so that we can then select them in CSS in order to style them. And actually, we also use IDs and classes to select elements from JavaScript when we do DOM manipulation. So classes and IDs are crucial to identifying elements, and especially classes. And here's how that works. And again, we can add them on any element. So let's add one here to this paragraph. So all we have to do is class, and let's call this one the first. Okay, because it's the first of these two paragraphs. And then here, class again. And you guessed it, this one is going to be called second. And we're going to use these in the next lecture to then select the two paragraphs and style them differently. So then according to these classes. Now, as I said, beside classes, we also have IDs. And they work like this. So let's add it here to the image. Let's call it course image, just like this. Now, the difference between classes and IDs is that IDs have to be unique. Okay, so each ID can only be used once on the page, while classes can be used over and over again. So I could have more paragraphs called second, but I could not have another element called course image. All right. In practice, we actually almost never use IDs to style elements or to select them from JavaScript. It's just a better practice to use classes. Okay, and now to finish, let's create an HTML form so that we can use some more attributes. Okay, so let's do that here after the image. And now I will also introduce you to the idea of basically creating boxes. So we want the contents of this form to be in a box. And so there are many ways of creating boxes in HTML. The most generic box is a div. So let's say div, and let's give it a name here using an ID again, just that so we use classes and IDs in different places so that you can learn how to use both. So I'm calling this box here your name because that's what we're going to do in this form. So just an input asking for the user's name, basically. Okay, and here it already closed the element for me. Oh, and maybe you're also noticing that for the names here, so the ID name, but also for class names, in CSS we use the dash to separate two different words. So in JavaScript, we would use camel case, so course, and then like this, right? But the convention in CSS is to write it like this. Of course, it would also work the other way, but this is just a convention. Okay, and let's create just a heading for this form, your name here. Okay, and you can see that, of course, we can have multiple H2 elements here on the same page. So we have here a secondary heading and here another one. Okay, so we already have the H2 here now, and there's also this box around it, but you cannot really see it. But we will see it in the next lecture when we actually style all of these elements using CSS. Anyway, let's now add another paragraph here. Please fill in this form. And now let's actually use an input element. And so with that, we are then basically creating a form. So input, and then we use the type attribute to specify the type of data that should be inputted into this element. So once again, we're using an attribute to describe this element. So here we could use text, or as you can see here, we could use button, checkbox, email, file, and so on and so forth. But here we're just going to use text. And then we can even specify a placeholder. Now we'll just use the autocomplete functionality here. Okay. And we close it. And once more, this is one of the elements which does not have a closing tag. Because, well, again, it doesn't make much sense to have that here. And then usually a form also has a button. And so for that, we have the button element. And in this case, it actually makes sense to have content. And so that's why there is a closing tag, which VS Code automatically placed there for us. Let's give it a save. And here we go. Nice. So we have a nice input and a button. Now, of course, nothing will happen because for that, we would need some JavaScript. But that's not the point of this lecture or of this section. But now you know how to create a form like this. And now just to finish this form, we should actually change the name or the type of the element of this box here. Okay? Because this is now a form because it has this input and this button elements. And so in HTML, we have a special element for that, which is instead of div, we use form. Okay? Give it a save and it looks exactly the same, but this is more semantic. What this means is that the form element better describes the content that is inside of the box than just the generic box that is the div. Okay? So the div element is really just a generic box which has no meaning at all. And so that's usually not a good idea for many reasons. For example, for SEO. When Google searches your page, it's better if it knows exactly what each element means than just having generic boxes without any meaning at all. Okay? So using the appropriate element according to the content that's in it is the idea of semantic HTML. In this case, we are creating a form here because we have an input and a button, and so we use the form element that HTML gives us just for this purpose. Okay? It looks exactly the same as a div element, but it has meaning, and so it's semantic. Okay, and that's it for this video. In the next one, we're finally gonna style all this using some HTML.